Here's a paradox that should make you deeply uncomfortable. The United States, the world's largest oil producer, just launched a military operation to seize oil fields in Venezuela. If America is energy independent, if the shale revolution solved everything, why are special forces landing in Caracas? Most explanations focus on Maduro's dictatorship, on human rights, on restoring democracy. Those explanations are convenient. They're also missing the mechanism entirely. This isn't about one strong man or one country. This is about a financial architecture that's fracturing, and what happens when an empire can't pay its bills with paper anymore. To understand why American helicopters just landed in Venezuela, we need to follow a trail that leads from Texas refineries to Chinese bank vaults. Right now, across every news network, you're watching the same story on repeat. Special forces descending from the sky. A Latin American president in handcuffs. Commentators praising tactical precision and strategic brilliance. The footage is spectacular. It's designed to be. Because if you're watching the helicopters, you're not watching the balance sheet. 2 days before those helicopters launched, something happened that almost nobody reported. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, quietly requested a meeting with Venezuelan officials in Panama. Not to threaten, not to impose conditions, to negotiate access to oil that Washington has spent 23 years trying to destroy. Let that sink in for a moment. The same administration that had sanctioned Venezuela, frozen its assets, recognized a parallel president-funded opposition movements. That administration was suddenly asking politely for the one thing they'd been trying to take by other means for 2 decades. Then the meeting failed. And 48 hours later, the helicopters appeared. This wasn't regime change for democracy. This was a debt collection operation with gunships. Ricardo Mendez still remembers the exact moment he understood what was coming. He was standing in the control room of the Port Arthur refinery in Texas, watching flow rates that hadn't been right in months. 53 years old, 31 years in the refining business, and Ricardo knew something that most Americans don't. American oil is the wrong kind of oil. Picture 2 glasses side by side on a table. One contains champagne, light, bubbly, expensive. The other contains motor oil, thick, dark, viscous. The United States produces champagne. Light, sweet crude from shale formations in Texas and North Dakota. It's valuable. It's profitable. And it's not what American refineries were built to process. The massive facilities along the Gulf Coast, Port Arthur, Baytown, Baton Rouge, were constructed 50 years ago to handle heavy, sour crude, the thick sludge that comes from Venezuela's Orinoco Belt and the Middle East. Billions of dollars of infrastructure, millions of jobs, an entire industrial ecosystem designed for a specific type of oil that America doesn't produce. Ricardo's refinery was running at 63% capacity. Not because demand was low, because the crude they needed wasn't available. We're the best in the world at processing heavy crude, Ricardo told me last month. And we're starving for it. That's the joke nobody in Washington wants to explain. Here's the question that should be on every news broadcast but isn't. If America is truly energy independent, why did special forces just seize the largest oil reserves on Earth? The answer involves numbers that the administration would prefer you never see. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the emergency stockpile meant to protect America during wars and national crises, is currently at 351 million barrels. That's the lowest level since 1983. In 2022 alone, 180 million barrels were released to control gas prices before the midterm elections. Those barrels have not been replaced. They cannot be replaced quickly. And the reserve that was designed to sustain America through a major conflict is now barely sufficient for a minor disruption. What most people get wrong about the shale revolution is thinking it solved America's energy problem. It didn't. It created a different problem, a mismatch between what America produces and what America needs. The shale miracle is real, but it's champagne when the engines run on diesel. Chen Weiming was in a conference room in Beijing when news of the Venezuela operation broke. 47 years old, a senior director at CNPC China's state oil company, he had personally overseen the signing of contracts worth $62 billion in Venezuelan oil over the past 17 years. Chen didn't panic. He made phone calls. Calm, methodical, strategic. "We always knew this was possible," Chen explained to his team. "The contracts are still valid. The oil is still there. The question is not whether they can take it. The question is whether they can keep it." Those $62 billion in prepayment contracts represent oil that China has already paid for. Oil that Venezuela has already committed to deliver. The American operation didn't just seize infrastructure, it seized collateral that belongs to Beijing. Chen's team spent the next 72 hours mapping legal options, alternative suppliers, and escalation scenarios. None of their responses will appear in American newspapers. All of them will shape what happens next. Contrast Chen's position with Maria Fernanda Gutierrez, a 51-year-old administrator at PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company. She was at headquarters in Caracas when the helicopters appeared over the city. Maria earned the equivalent of $47 per month. Her pension fund, built over 26 years, was worth less than $800 after hyperinflation destroyed the bolivar. When the special forces came, she wasn't thinking about geopolitics. She was thinking about whether her daughter in Colombia could wire money for groceries. The operation that Chen Weiming is strategically managing from Beijing is the operation that upended Maria's entire life. Same event, separated by an ocean and a chasm of power. December 28, 2024. 2 days before Sullivan's failed meeting in Panama, Nicolas Maduro stood in the Miraflores Palace and signed energy agreements with China worth $18 billion. New investments, new infrastructure, new commitments, all denominated in yuan, all processed through systems that bypass the dollar entirely. This wasn't just a trade deal. This was a declaration of financial independence. And Washington understood exactly what it meant. There's an old rule in geopolitics that everyone pretends doesn't exist. You cannot sanction countries that control your vital resources. Not forever. Not without consequences. For 23 years, the United States tried to defy this rule with Venezuela. Sanctions, asset freezes, diplomatic isolation. Proxy governments, maximum pressure. Everything except direct military intervention. Every single strategy failed. The sanctions failed because Venezuela built export networks completely outside the SWIFT banking system. Ships with flags of convenience payments in yuan refineries in Malaysia, processing Venezuelan crude. Washington discovered that sanctioning paper doesn't stop oil molecules from moving. The regime change attempts failed so spectacularly that they became international embarrassments. Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader, America recognized as the legitimate president, never controlled a single military barracks. By 2023, even the Venezuelan opposition had abandoned him. The diplomatic isolation failed because 134 countries never recognized America's preferred government. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. The major Latin American powers all restored full diplomatic relations with Maduro between 2022 and 2024, completely ignoring Washington's objections. When every other tool fails, there's only one tool left, and that tool descended from helicopters in the middle of the night. James Morrison is a 61-year-old energy analyst at a major Wall Street firm. He spent 40 years tracking oil markets, and he recognized the Venezuela operation for what it was the moment it happened. "This isn't strength," James told his clients in a private memo the morning after the raid. "This is desperation wearing tactical gear. When you have to use military force to secure oil access, you've already lost the argument. You've just decided to win the fight anyway." James has seen this pattern before: Iraq, Libya. The promise is always the same. Quick intervention, smooth transition, oil flowing within months. The reality is always more complicated, always more expensive, always more destructive than anyone in the planning rooms anticipated. "The helicopters are the easy part," James wrote. "The next 20 years are the hard part, and I'm not sure anyone in Washington has thought past next week." Picture a timeline stretching from 2001 to today. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Each intervention launched with confidence, with promises of swift resolution, with assurances that American forces would be home soon. Each one became something longer, messier, and more costly than anyone predicted. Venezuela is not Afghanistan. Venezuela is not Iraq. But the pattern of American intervention has a consistency that transcends geography. The operation is over. Maduro is in custody. The press conferences are finished. And the real story, the one that will determine oil prices, dollar value, and American power for the next generation, is just beginning. To understand why helicopters landed in Caracas, you need to understand a problem that has nothing to do with Venezuela and everything to do with a pipe running from Texas to Louisiana. Let me explain the mechanism that made this operation inevitable. Imagine you own a restaurant. You've built the most sophisticated kitchen in the world, billions of dollars in equipment, decades of expertise the best chef's money can buy. But there's a catch. Your kitchen was designed to cook one specific ingredient: Wagyu beef. Only Wagyu beef. And for 50 years, your suppliers delivered Wagyu reliably at prices you could afford. Then one day, your suppliers stopped delivering. Some raised prices. Some started selling to competitors. Some just disappeared. And you're standing in your billion-dollar kitchen surrounded by equipment that can only process one thing, and that thing is no longer available. That's the situation facing American refineries right now. Except the kitchen is the Gulf Coast refining complex, and the Wagyu beef is heavy sour crude from Venezuela. Ricardo Mendez, the refinery manager in Port Arthur we met earlier, can recite these numbers from memory. The Gulf Coast refinery system represents over 9 million barrels per day of processing capacity. It was built between 1940 and 1980, designed specifically for heavy crude, the kind that flows like molasses thick with sulfur, and metals requiring specialized equipment to process. America produces 13 million barrels of oil per day. But most of that production is light sweet crude from shale formations. It's the wrong product for the existing infrastructure. Like filling a diesel truck with premium gasoline, technically it's fuel, but the engine won't run right. For decades, this mismatch didn't matter because heavy crude imports were reliable. Venezuela, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. The suppliers were diverse enough that no single disruption caused crisis. Then, one by one, those sources disappeared. Mexico's production collapsed due to underinvestment. Their heavy crude exports to America fell from 1.4 million barrels daily in 2004 to less than 400,000 barrels today. Saudi Arabia pivoted. The kingdom cut production to keep prices high, joined BRICS, and made clear that being America's gas station was no longer their strategic priority. Iraq remains unstable, its production hostage to internal politics and regional conflicts. That left Venezuela. And Venezuela was supposed to be under control. Here's what most people get wrong about American sanctions on Venezuela. They weren't designed to collapse the economy, although they did that. They were designed to create leverage, to make Maduro so desperate that he would eventually accept American terms for oil access. The logic seemed sound. Strangle the economy, freeze the assets, recognize an alternative government, wait for the regime to crack. It was the playbook that worked in dozens of other countries. It didn't work in Venezuela. And the reason it didn't work reveals something important about how power is shifting globally. Lucia Morales was a compliance officer at Citibank in New York when Venezuelan sanctions first expanded in 2017. 42 years old, specialized in Latin American transactions, she processed the paperwork that froze Venezuelan government accounts. "We thought we were closing doors," Lucia remembers. "We were actually just opening different ones." Within 18 months of maximum sanctions, Venezuela had established alternative financial channels that bypassed American banks entirely. Payments routed through Moscow. Shipping handled by Greek companies that didn't care about American pressure. Crude processed in Malaysian refineries and re-exported as Asian product. The sanctions didn't stop oil from moving. They just changed who profited from moving it. Picture a map of global oil flows with Venezuela at the center. Before sanctions, the lines ran north to American refineries. After sanctions, new lines appeared running east to China, south to India, around the globe, through intermediaries that Washington couldn't control. India in particular became a crucial node. Today, India imports 340,000 barrels daily of Venezuelan crude. They refine it in facilities built specifically to handle heavy oil, then export the finished products to Europe. European countries that officially support Venezuelan sanctions are buying Venezuelan oil laundered through Indian intermediaries. The system found a way around the obstacle. It always does. But here's where the mechanism gets interesting. Because Venezuela didn't just survive sanctions, it thrived in ways that threatened something far more important than oil supply. Andrei Volkov is a 56-year-old banker in Moscow who specializes in non-dollar trade settlements. Before 2017, his work was niche theoretical academic papers about alternative payment systems that nobody actually used. Today, Andrei manages transactions worth billions of rubles monthly. His clients include Venezuelan oil companies, Chinese manufacturers, Indian refiners, and a growing network of businesses that have decided they no longer need American financial infrastructure. The Americans taught us how to do this, Andrei says with something approaching gratitude. Every sanction forced us to build capability we didn't have before. Now we have it, and we don't need permission anymore. The system Andrei operates is called CPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system. Think of it as the Chinese answer to SWIFT, the Western-dominated network that processes most international transactions. Before sanctions pushed countries away from dollar systems, CIPS was a minor player. Today it processes over 26,000 transactions daily. The growth rate is accelerating, and every transaction that clears through CIPS is a transaction that doesn't clear through American banks. This is the threat that helicopters were sent to address. Not just Venezuelan oil, but the demonstration effect of Venezuelan survival outside the dollar system. Let me ask you a question that cuts to the heart of American financial power. Why does the world use dollars? The official answer involves stability, liquidity, trust in American institutions. Those factors matter, but they're not the fundamental driver. The fundamental driver is oil. In 1974, Henry Kissinger negotiated what historians call the petrodollar agreement. Saudi Arabia would price all its oil in dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection for the Saudi regime. Every other major oil exporter followed Saudi Arabia's lead. This created a brilliant mechanism. Every country that needs oil needs dollars to buy it. That demand for dollars allows America to print money without immediate inflation consequences, to borrow cheaply when other countries couldn't, to run deficits that would collapse any other economy. The dollar isn't strong because America has the best economy. The dollar is strong because for 50 years the world had no choice but to use it. Now that choice exists. And Venezuela just proved it. Remember Chen Weiming, the CNPC director in Beijing, managing $62 billion in Venezuelan oil contracts. Those contracts aren't denominated in dollars. They're structured as oil for loans agreements settled in yuan. Venezuela receives Chinese manufactured goods infrastructure investment and technical support. China receives oil. No dollars change hands. No American banks process the transactions. The entire exchange happens outside the system that Washington has controlled since 1974. On December 28, 2024, Maduro signed agreements worth $18 billion. Except they weren't dollars. They were yuan-denominated commitments that locked Venezuela's oil sector even more firmly into Chinese financial architecture. 2 days later, Jake Sullivan was in Panama asking politely for access. The meeting failed. Not because Venezuela was unreasonable. Because Venezuela no longer needed to be reasonable. They had an alternative buyer offering better terms with no conditions attached. Here's the contrarian point that most analysts are missing. The Venezuela operation wasn't about securing oil for America. America can survive without Venezuelan crude painfully expensively, but survivably. The operation was about preventing demonstration, about stopping other oil producers from learning what Venezuela proved, that you can price crude outside the dollar system and survive. If Venezuela succeeds, Saudi Arabia takes notice. If Saudi Arabia shifts more transactions to yuan, the petrodollar fractures further. If the petrodollar fractures, the mechanism that allows America to borrow cheaply and print freely begins to collapse. That's the domino effect Washington couldn't allow. Patricia Hernandez is a 63-year-old economist at the Central Bank of Venezuela who has watched this dynamic unfold from inside the system. She was in Caracas when the helicopters came. She wasn't surprised. "They weren't afraid of our oil," Patricia explained. "They were afraid of our example. Every barrel we sell in yuan is a barrel that proves the dollar is optional, and the dollar cannot afford to be optional." Patricia's insight clarifies why the operation happened now, why this week, why the timing seemed so urgent. The $18 billion Chinese deal wasn't just investment. It was infrastructure, payment systems, technical assistance, refining capacity. The kind of infrastructure that takes years to dismantle once it's built. If America waited another year, another 18 months, the Chinese financial presence in Venezuela would have been so deeply embedded that removing it would require not just regime change, but complete economic reconstruction. The window was closing, so they stopped waiting. Picture a timeline showing Venezuelan oil infrastructure transitioning from Western to Chinese systems. Each year, more capacity. Each year, deeper integration. Each year, harder to reverse. The helicopters were a clock-stopping measure, an attempt to freeze the system before the next phase locked in. But here's the problem with clock-stopping measures. They only work if you can restart the clock on your own terms. Ricardo Mendez is still waiting for oil that can run his refinery. Maria Fernanda Gutierrez is still waiting to learn what happens to her pension. Chen Weiming is still mapping legal options for contracts that technically still exist. The operation changed who controls the palace in Caracas. It hasn't changed the fundamental dynamics that made the operation necessary. Those dynamics are accelerating, not resolving. And what happens next will determine whether the helicopters bought time or just accelerated the collapse they were meant to prevent. Now let me show you what was actually happening while you watch the helicopters. The press conference was theater. The handcuffs were props for cameras. The story being told was not the story being executed. At 2:47 a.m., Caracas time. While special forces secured the presidential palace, a different team was securing something far more important. Not a person. A building. The PDVSA headquarters in La Campiña, where every oil contract, every export agreement, every financial arrangement for Venezuela's energy sector is documented and stored. That building was secured before Maduro was even in custody. The contracts were the priority. The president was the narrative. Let me show you the gap between what you were told and what actually happened. The public story. A dictator oppressed his people. America intervened to restore democracy. Justice served. The mechanism story. An oil-rich nation tried to exit the dollar system. America intervened to prevent the precedent. Assets seized. Both stories are partially true. Neither is complete. The complete story is what this section is about. Jorge Ramirez was the night security supervisor at PDVSA headquarters when the operation began. 54 years old, 28 years with the company, he watched men in tactical gear stream through doors he had protected for decades. They didn't ask about Maduro, Jorge remembers. They asked about the server room. They asked about contract archives. They asked where the Chinese kept their documentation. They had a list of specific file numbers. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Jorge was detained for 6 hours, questioned about file locations, then released without charges. He wasn't important. The files were important. Within 48 hours of the operation, American legal teams had filed motions in courts across 3 continents: London, Singapore, The Hague. The motions sought to invalidate Chinese oil prepayment contracts signed over the past 17 years. Picture a legal timeline stretching from 2007 to 2024. Each year, new contracts. Each contract, Chinese money advanced in exchange for future oil deliveries. $62 billion total. All of it now contested. The argument being made in those courtrooms is extraordinary. American lawyers are claiming that the Maduro government was illegitimate. Therefore, all contracts signed by that government are void. $62 billion in agreements erased with a legal theory. Chen Weiming, the CNPC director we've followed throughout this story, had anticipated this moment. His legal team began preparing counterclaims months ago. The Chinese position is simple. The contracts were valid when signed, recognized by international law. And changing governments doesn't change commercial obligations. This will take years to resolve, possibly decades. And while lawyers argue in courtrooms, oil will either flow or it won't, and someone will either profit or they won't. Here's the question that reveals everything about the real purpose of this operation. If America wanted Venezuelan oil, why didn't they just buy it? The answer exposes the fraud at the heart of the public narrative. Venezuela was selling oil, actively, continuously to anyone willing to pay. China was paying. India was paying. Malaysia, Turkey, even European countries through intermediaries, they were all paying. The oil was available. It just wasn't available on American terms. American terms meant dollar denomination. American terms meant running transactions through SWIFT. American terms meant compliance with a sanctions regime that Venezuela had spent years learning to circumvent. What America wanted wasn't oil. What America wanted was control over how that oil was priced and traded. Pause this video for a moment and absorb what that means. The operation cost billions of dollars. It created diplomatic crises with half a dozen nations. It risked military confrontation with countries that have nuclear weapons. It destabilized an entire hemisphere, not to get oil, to prevent oil from being sold in the wrong currency. That's not national security. That's currency enforcement through military force. Valentina Rojas was a schoolteacher in Maracaibo, Venezuela's second-largest city. 41 years old, mother of 3, she earned the equivalent of $32 per month. Her school had no functioning air conditioning, intermittent electricity, and textbooks that were 15 years out of date. When the helicopters came, Valentina felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe things would finally change. Maybe foreign investment would flow. Maybe her salary would mean something again. That was 3 weeks ago. Today, Valentina's school is still broken. Her salary is still worthless. The change she hoped for hasn't arrived. They came to take the oil, Valentina told her sister last week. Not to fix the schools, not to feed the children, just the oil. We were never the point. Valentina is correct. She was never the point. And here's the rage moment that should make your blood pressure rise. The same week that American forces secured Venezuelan oil infrastructure, the administration announced emergency relief funding for the Venezuelan people. The amount $85 million. $85 million. For a country of 28 million people experiencing one of the worst humanitarian crises in hemispheric history. That works out to roughly $3 per person. Now, compare that to the value of what was seized. Venezuela's oil reserves are worth at current prices approximately $12 trillion. The infrastructure being secured, refineries, pipelines, export terminals, represents another $200 billion in assets. $12 trillion in resources. $3 per person in aid. The math tells you everything about priorities. The press conference tells you nothing. What most people get wrong about this operation is thinking it was about Venezuela at all. Venezuela was the location. Venezuela was the target. But Venezuela was not the purpose. The purpose was global. The purpose was systemic. The purpose was about what happens when oil-producing nations realize they have options. Remember Patricia Hernandez, the central bank economist, who said they were afraid of Venezuela's example, not Venezuela's oil. She understood something that most Western analysts still refuse to acknowledge. The petrodollar system survives on the absence of alternatives. Not because it's the best system. Not because countries prefer it. Because for 50 years there was no other option that worked at scale. CIPS changed that. Chinese infrastructure spending changed that. Russian sanctions evasion technology changed that. Venezuela surviving maximum pressure for 7 years changed that. The alternative exists now. It works. Countries are using it. And the Venezuela operation was supposed to prove that using it has consequences. But here's the first twist that complicates the intended message. The operation didn't silence the alternative. It advertised it. Within 72 hours of helicopters landing in Caracas, 3 things happened that will never appear in American headlines. First, Saudi Arabia accelerated its BRICS integration timeline. Meetings that were scheduled for March were moved to January. The kingdom is hedging faster than anyone predicted. Second, Brazil announced new bilateral currency agreements with China, expanding trade settlement in reais and yuan. The largest economy in South America is diversifying away from dollar dependency in direct response to watching what happened to Venezuela. Third, India, supposedly a strategic partner of the United States, increased its Venezuelan oil imports through intermediary channels. Not decreased. Increased. The sanctions that America is trying to reimpose are being ignored before they're even formally announced. The operation was supposed to demonstrate American strength. Instead, it demonstrated American desperation. And the world noticed. Marcus Thompson is a 53-year-old hedge fund manager in Connecticut who has spent 30 years trading commodities. He was on a call with clients when the Venezuela news broke. His immediate reaction surprised even himself. "My first thought wasn't about oil prices," Marcus admits. "My first thought was, this is what decline looks like. When you have to invade to secure resources you used to buy freely, you've already lost the economic argument. You've just decided to win the military one instead." Marcus has repositioned his portfolio. More exposure to non-dollar assets. More hedging against currency volatility. More attention to what China and Russia are building, while America is distracted with tactical operations. "The helicopters were impressive," Marcus says. "The strategy is terrifying. We're watching an empire that's forgotten how empires actually fall." Here's the second twist that almost nobody is discussing. The operation may not even work on its own terms. Securing a palace is easy. Securing an oil industry is extraordinarily difficult. Venezuela's petroleum infrastructure has deteriorated severely over the past decade. Underinvestment, brain drain, corruption sanctions. The refineries need billions in repairs. The pipelines need rehabilitation. The skilled workers needed to run these systems have largely fled the country. Remember Ricardo Mendez, the refinery manager in Port Arthur, waiting for heavy crude? He left Venezuela in 2018 because the industry was collapsing. Thousands of engineers like him did the same. They're in Houston, in Calgary, and Dubai. Getting them to return requires more than regime change. It requires stability, security, and trust that investments won't be seized again when the next government changes. Carlos Vega is a 51-year-old petroleum engineer who worked at PDVSA's Orinoco projects for 18 years before emigrating to Texas. He's been contacted by 3 different recruiters in the past week, all offering premium salaries to return to Venezuela. "I told them all the same thing," Carlos says. "Who's in charge? Not which name is on the palace door. Who actually controls the oil fields? Who signs my contract? Who protects me if things go wrong?" Nobody could answer, so I said no. Carlos isn't alone. The brain drain that crippled Venezuelan production won't reverse overnight. And without skilled workers, the oil that justified this entire operation will stay in the ground. Now here's the third twist, the one that connects everything. While American forces were securing oil infrastructure, Chinese technicians were securing something else: data. Before communications were cut to PDVSA headquarters, encrypted transmissions were sent to servers in Shanghai. Contract details, geological surveys, production records, financial arrangements. Years of proprietary information about Venezuelan oil operations. The physical infrastructure may now be under American-aligned control. The knowledge of how to operate it, who to negotiate with where the problems are, that knowledge is backed up in Beijing. Chen Weiming smiled when he confirmed the data transfer was complete. "They can have the buildings," he said. "We have the blueprints." This changes the leverage calculation entirely. American companies entering Venezuela will face a learning curve that Chinese companies have already climbed. Every negotiation, every technical challenge, every operational decision, Beijing has information that Washington lacks. The operation seized territory. It didn't seize advantage. Picture two chess players at a board. One has captured the center squares through force. The other has mapped every possible move for the next 20 turns. Who's actually winning? The press conference declared victory. The mechanism suggests something more complicated. James Morrison, the Wall Street analyst who called this operation "desperation wearing tactical gear," updated his clients last week. His assessment was blunt. The best-case scenario is that Venezuelan production returns to 1.5 million barrels daily within 3 years. That's the optimistic projection. It requires political stability, massive investment workforce return, and no significant resistance. None of those conditions currently exist. The worst-case scenario is that this becomes Iraq. Decade-long occupation, insurgency, infrastructure sabotage, and oil production that never reaches pre-intervention levels. We've seen this movie before. The ending wasn't happy. James isn't predicting which scenario unfolds. He's pointing out that the range of outcomes is wide, the downside is severe, and the people making decisions seem unprepared for anything except the best case. The helicopters have landed. Maduro is in custody. The operation is declared complete. But operations don't end when the shooting stops. They end when the objectives are achieved. And the objectives here: stable oil production, dollar denomination, restored American leverage. None of them have been achieved yet. What happens next will determine whether this was a strategic masterstroke or a catastrophic overreach. And based on every historical precedent, we have what happens next is considerably more complicated than anyone standing at a podium wants to admit. The victory lap is premature. The consequences are just beginning. The operation took 72 hours. The consequences will take decades to unfold. This is how systems unravel, not in dramatic explosions, but in slow erosion. Not in single catastrophic moments, but in accumulated decisions that each seem manageable until they're not. The petrodollar didn't die the night helicopters landed in Caracas. It just became terminally ill, and the prognosis is measured in years, not months. Let me show you what the next decade looks like. Not speculation, pattern recognition. The trajectory already visible if you know where to look. Valentina Rojas, the schoolteacher in Maracaibo earning $32 per month, will be 51 years old in 2035. If current patterns hold, and there's no structural reason to expect them to change, her salary will rise to approximately $150 monthly. That sounds like progress until you calculate what she'll have lost. Valentina had savings before hyperinflation destroyed the bolivar. Roughly $4,000 accumulated over 15 years of teaching. That money became worthless between 2016 and 2019. It will never be recovered. When she retires in 2040, she'll have worked for 35 years and accumulated less wealth than an American teenager saves from a summer job. By 2035, Valentina will have watched 2 of her 3 children emigrate. They'll send remittances, perhaps $200 monthly, that become her primary income. She'll have spent her career educating Venezuelan children who leave Venezuela as adults. Her contribution to her country will be measured in the human capital that flows elsewhere. That's not a personal failure. That's a structural outcome. The system produces what it was designed to produce. Now contrast Valentina's trajectory with someone positioned on the winning side of this restructuring. David Lancaster is a 46-year-old petroleum engineer at a major American oil services company in Houston. He specializes in heavy crude extraction, exactly the skill set that Venezuelan operations require. When the Caracas operation concluded, David's phone started ringing. By 2027, David projects he'll be managing a rehabilitation project somewhere in the Orinoco Belt. His compensation package, approximately $500,000 annually, plus hazard premiums, plus performance bonuses tied to production milestones. By 2030, if production stabilizes, David estimates his Venezuelan earnings will have reached $4 million cumulative. By 2035, he plans to be retired consulting part-time, living comfortably off investments made during the Venezuelan boom. David will earn more from 5 years of Venezuelan work than Valentina will earn in her entire lifetime. Not because he works harder, not because he contributes more to society, because he stands on the extraction side of the equation while she stands on the extracted side. Picture a chart showing these two trajectories side by side. David's wealth curve climbing steeply upward. Valentina's flat, barely visible at the bottom of the graph. Same country, same decade, opposite outcomes. The distance between those lines is the shape of the system working as designed. Here's the question that should haunt every analyst watching Venezuela. What happens when oil money flows, but countries don't develop? We have historical precedents. They're not encouraging. Iraq had the world's fifth largest oil reserves when America invaded in 2003. 22 years later, Iraqi oil production has increased substantially, from 2.5 million barrels daily to nearly 4.5 million. By that metric, the intervention succeeded. But look at the population. Iraqi per capita income has barely moved in 2 decades. Infrastructure remains devastated. Brain drain continues. The oil flows, but the benefits concentrate in small circles while the broader society stagnates. Libya tells a similar story. Before 2011, Libya produced 1.6 million barrels daily. Gaddafi was removed. The country fragmented. Today, production fluctuates wildly, depending on which militia controls which territory. The oil still moves when pipelines aren't being sabotaged, but it moves into offshore accounts rather than Libyan development. Venezuela fits this pattern with disturbing precision. The oil will eventually flow again. The question is where it flows to. What most people get wrong about resource extraction is thinking it automatically generates prosperity. It doesn't. It generates revenue. Revenue becomes prosperity only if institutions exist to distribute it, and institutions take decades to build when they're not being actively destroyed. The Venezuelan state has been systematically hollowed out over 25 years. First by Chávez's parallel institutions, then by Maduro's survival economics, now by occupation that prioritizes extraction over reconstruction. Each phase removed capacity that won't return easily. Carmen Delgado is a 57-year-old civil servant who has worked in Venezuela's finance ministry since 1994. She's survived every government transition, every economic crisis, every wave of sanctions and counter-sanctions. Her institutional knowledge is irreplaceable. Last week, Carmen received an offer from a multinational consulting firm. They want her expertise to navigate Venezuelan bureaucracy on behalf of American oil companies entering the market. The salary $12,000 monthly, 300 times what she earns as a government employee. Carmen hasn't decided yet. Part of her wants to stay to help rebuild from the inside. Part of her knows that staying means watching foreign consultants earn her annual salary every week while she processes their paperwork. By 2030, Carmen will either have left government service or watched most of her colleagues do so. The brain drain that gutted PDVSA will repeat across every ministry. The institutional capacity needed for genuine development will evaporate into private sector salaries that the public sector can't match. This is the second phase of extraction. First, the oil. Then the people who know how to run the country. Now, here's the twist that transforms this from Venezuelan tragedy to global consequence. The Venezuela operation didn't just affect Venezuela. It sent a signal that every oil-producing nation received clearly, and they're responding in ways that won't appear in American headlines, but will reshape the global economy for decades. Remember Andrei Volkov, the Moscow banker managing non-dollar transactions. His business has tripled since the Venezuela operation. Countries that were cautiously exploring alternatives to the dollar system are now urgently accelerating. Before Caracas, diversifying away from the dollar was a long-term project, Andrei explains. After Caracas, it's a survival priority. Everyone saw what happens to countries that try to leave the system peacefully. They drew the obvious conclusion: leave faster, leave, further leave, irreversibly. By 2030, Andrei projects that CIEP's transaction volume will have increased fivefold. By 2035, he believes a significant portion of global oil trade will settle outside dollar systems, not because those systems are better, but because they're safer. The Venezuela operation was supposed to reinforce dollar dominance. It's actually accelerating dollar decline. And the people making these decisions seem unable to recognize the paradox. Picture a graph showing global dollar reserve holdings over time. The line was declining slowly before Caracas dropping from 72% of global reserves in 2000 to 58% by 2024. After Caracas, the trajectory steepens. Each intervention intended to protect the dollar creates new urgency to escape it. The empire is defending its currency by demonstrating exactly why other countries shouldn't trust that currency. The logic is circular. The outcome is predictable. Here's the second twist that nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge. American consumers will pay for this operation. Not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. The dollar's reserve status has provided enormous benefits to American citizens for 50 years. Lower interest rates on mortgages because Treasury bonds are in global demand. Lower prices on imports because sellers want dollars. Lower inflation than economic fundamentals would otherwise allow. As reserve status erodes, those benefits erode with it. Interest rates rise. Import prices climb. The purchasing power that Americans take for granted diminishes. Marcus Thompson, the hedge fund manager who called this "what decline looks like," has been running projections for his clients. His models suggest that every 10 percentage points of lost reserve currency status translates to roughly 1.5% additional inflation for American consumers. We're at 58% reserves now, Marcus explains. If we drop to 45% by 2035, which is aggressive but not implausible, given current trends, that's an extra 2% inflation built into the baseline. Every year, compounding. By 2035, Marcus estimates the average American household will be paying an extra $3,000 annually in inflation costs directly attributable to reserve currency erosion. That's not a recession. That's not a crisis. That's just the slow bleeding of an advantage that most Americans don't even know they have. The helicopters were free entertainment. The costs will arrive later disguised as grocery prices and mortgage rates and retirement accounts that don't grow as fast as they should. Jorge Ramirez, the security supervisor at PDVSA headquarters, who watched American teams seize contract archives, is 54 years old. He's been offered a position with the new security apparatus being installed by American advisors. Better pay, better conditions. Working for the occupiers of his own building. By 2030, Jorge projects two possible futures. In one, he takes the new job, becomes part of the extraction apparatus, and earns more than he ever did under PDVSA. In the other, he joins the resistance that's already forming in the interior. Not combat, just refusal. Quiet sabotage. The kind of low-level disruption that makes occupation expensive without ever becoming outright war. "I haven't decided which man I want to be," Jorge told his wife last week. "But I have to decide soon. There's no middle ground anymore." Jorge's choice will be multiplied across millions of Venezuelans. Each individual decision is small. Collectively, they determine whether the occupation succeeds or fails. History suggests the occupiers underestimate this calculation. They always do. The Colectivo's neighborhood militias that supported Maduro haven't surrendered. They've dispersed, weapons hidden, leadership scattered, waiting to see what happens before deciding what to do. The military officers who weren't captured are calculating. Some will defect to the new order. Some will organize resistance. Some will take their knowledge to China or Russia and sell it for resettlement packages. The workers who know how to operate the oil infrastructure are watching. If they see opportunity, they'll return. If they see exploitation, they'll stay away. Their decisions, not Washington's press conferences, will determine whether production recovers. This is the landscape that the operation created. Not stability. Suspended instability. A country holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of future emerges from the chaos. The trajectory from here branches into multiple possibilities. Best case, rapid stabilization, returning production, managed transition. Worst case, prolonged insurgency, perpetual disruption, another quagmire that drains resources for a generation. The historical pattern suggests something in between partial success that falls short of promises, gradual normalization that never quite completes lingering resentment that occasionally erupts extraction that continues regardless of political conditions. That middle path is the most likely. And it's the most corrosive for everyone involved. Venezuela won't collapse dramatically. It will erode continuously. Each year slightly worse than it could have been. Each opportunity slightly smaller than it should have been. Each generation slightly more depleted than the one before. The empire won't collapse dramatically either. It will erode the same way, slowly, persistently. One overreach at a time. One ally alienated at a time. 1 percentage point of reserve currency at a time. Both trajectories are now locked in. The decisions that could have prevented them were made years ago. What remains is management of decline, not reversal of it. And the people who will live with these consequences, the Valentinas and Jorges and Carmens of Venezuela, the ordinary Americans watching their purchasing power diminish. They had no voice in the decisions that shaped their futures. That's the real cost of the operation. Not the billions in military expenditure. Not the diplomatic isolation. Not even the strategic miscalculation. The real cost is measured in lives constrained by choices they didn't make, in futures narrowed by systems they don't control, in decades of diminished possibility that compound silently while everyone watches the next headline. The helicopters have left. The occupation continues, and the bill keeps coming due for people who never agreed to pay it. Let's return to where we started. The helicopters, the handcuffs, the press conferences celebrating tactical brilliance. That was the spectacle. Now you've seen the mechanism. And the mechanism reveals something that extends far beyond Venezuela. Picture a map of the Western Hemisphere with pressure points highlighted. Venezuela's oil fields now under occupation. Greenland's rare earth deposits under continuous pressure. The Panama Canal, subject to increasing demands. Canada facing trade ultimatums. These aren't separate stories. They're one pattern executing across multiple fronts. The pattern has a logic: secure resources, control pricing systems, deny competitors access. The methods vary: military force here, economic pressure there, diplomatic coercion elsewhere. But the objective is consistent. Lock the hemisphere into dollar-denominated systems before alternatives become irreversible. This isn't conspiracy. It's strategy. And strategy, once you understand it, becomes visible everywhere. Ricardo Mendez is still in Port Arthur. The refinery manager who explained that American oil is champagne. While American refineries need diesel, he's been watching developments closely since the Caracas operation. Last week, Ricardo received notice that his facility will be upgraded. New processing capacity for Venezuelan heavy crude expected to arrive within 18 months. The investment, $2.3 billion. His company is betting that the operation succeeds, that production recovers, that the oil flows north as promised. Ricardo isn't celebrating. He's been in this industry too long. "I've seen these bets before," Ricardo told me. "Iraq was supposed to supply us. Libya was supposed to supply us. Now Venezuela. The promises sound the same every time. The follow-through never matches." Ricardo will retire in 2031 regardless of what happens. His pension is secure. His concern isn't personal, it's professional. He's watched an industry built on reliability become dependent on geopolitical gambles. "We used to buy oil from people who wanted to sell it," Ricardo observes. "Now we seize oil from people who don't. That's not a business model. That's an empire in decline." Here's the framework for understanding what you're watching not just in Venezuela, but everywhere these patterns appear. When you see resource interventions, ask 3 questions. First, what's being secured and who benefits from that security? The official justification rarely matches the actual beneficiaries. Watch for the gap between rhetoric and contracts. Second, what currency denominates the transactions and what payment systems process them? This tells you more than any press conference. Currency enforcement is the hidden logic beneath most geopolitical moves. Third, what's the response from the countries being excluded? The counter moves often matter more than the original action. Watch what China, Russia, India, and Brazil do in the months after each intervention. These questions won't give you predictions. The future is genuinely uncertain. But they'll help you see the mechanism beneath the headlines. Chen Weiming is still in Shanghai managing the legal response to seized contracts. The CNPC director who watched $62 billion in prepayment agreements thrown into dispute, he's not panicking. He's adapting. "We always knew the American system was based on coercion," Chen explained to his board last week. "We just hoped it would take longer for them to prove it so publicly. Now they've proven it, and everyone who was hesitating is accelerating." Chen's team is redirecting resources. Instead of concentrating on Venezuelan partnerships, they're diversifying new agreements with Gulf states, expanded infrastructure in Africa, accelerated development of alternative payment systems. Venezuela taught us that any asset under American reach is an asset that can be seized, Chen says. So we're moving beyond their reach. Not out of anger, out of prudence. The operation was supposed to demonstrate American strength. To Chen, it demonstrated American limits. Both interpretations can be true simultaneously. Here's the contrarian point that challenges the entire narrative we've built. Maybe the operation works. Maybe Venezuelan oil production recovers to 2 million barrels daily within 3 years. Maybe the dollar system stabilizes. Maybe the message sent to other oil producers succeeds in deterring defection. Maybe American refineries run at full capacity, gas prices drop, and the strategic gamble pays off. History includes surprises. Systems that seemed destined to collapse have stabilized before. Interventions that seemed catastrophic have occasionally succeeded. The future isn't written yet. But here's what history doesn't include: interventions that succeeded by making their underlying problems worse. And the Venezuela operation, whatever its tactical achievements, has accelerated every structural challenge it was designed to address. The dollar system was fracturing. Now it's fracturing faster. Alternative payment networks were growing. Now they're growing faster. Countries were hedging against American power. Now they're hedging harder. You can win every tactical battle and still lose the war. The question is whether anyone in charge understands the difference. Maria Fernanda Gutierrez, the PDVSA administrator who earned $47 monthly before the operation, is still in Caracas. She's been offered a position with the Transitional Authority, Better pay, new management, American oversight. Maria hasn't decided yet. She's watching what happens to colleagues who took similar offers. Some are thriving. Some have disappeared into investigations. The new order rewards cooperation but punishes the wrong kind of history. They want our knowledge, Maria says, but they don't want our memory. They want us to explain how the system works while forgetting why it broke. Maria will make her choice within the month. Either way, she knows she's participating in a system she doesn't control, working for people who see her as a resource rather than a citizen. That's what it means to be Venezuelan now, Maria says quietly. You're either useful or you're invisible. There's no third option. The story we've traced from Ricardo's refinery to Chen's boardroom, from Valentina's classroom to David's windfall, is not really about Venezuela. It's about a global system reorganizing itself in real time. The petrodollar era is ending, not because someone decided to end it, because the conditions that created it have changed. The United States no longer controls global oil supply. China has built alternative financial infrastructure. Countries that were once dependent now have options. The Venezuela operation was an attempt to slow this transition, to buy time, to demonstrate that the old rules still apply. But you can't stop structural change with helicopters. You can delay it. You can make it messier. You can ensure that when it finally happens, it's more chaotic and more painful than it needed to be. But you can't stop it. The world is reorganizing. New systems are being built. New alliances are forming. New currencies are emerging. And the country that could have led that transition, that could have shaped it in ways that preserved its influence, has instead chosen to fight it with everything it has. That's the tragedy here. Not that change is coming. Change was always coming. The tragedy is that it's going to be harder than it needed to be, for everyone. Watch what happens next. Not the headlines, the details. Watch whether Venezuelan oil production actually recovers. Watch whether American companies can operate safely. Watch whether the new government, whatever it looks like, has any legitimacy with the Venezuelan people. Watch whether Saudi Arabia accelerates its BRICS integration. Watch whether China announces new yuan-denominated commodity agreements. Watch whether Brazil and India continue hedging against dollar exposure. Those are the signals that matter. Because the helicopters were just the opening scene. The real story is what comes after. The press conferences will move on to the next crisis. Maybe Greenland, maybe Canada, maybe something nobody's anticipating yet. But the mechanism we traced today, the refinery mismatch, the petrodollar fracture, the extraction economics that reward some while depleting others, that mechanism continues operating, whether you watch it or not. Understanding it doesn't change it, doesn't overthrow it, doesn't automatically protect you from it, but it lets you see clearly while others watch helicopters. And in a world where spectacle is designed to distract from structure, seeing clearly is the first form of power available to anyone who chooses to look. The empire is not collapsing in a dramatic explosion. It's eroding one decision at a time, one ally at a time, one percentage point of reserve currency at a time. The people making these decisions either don't understand what they're doing or don't care because the consequences won't arrive until they're out of office. But the consequences will arrive. They always do. And when they do, the people who pay won't be the generals or the politicians. It'll be the people watching this video. The people trying to pay rent, buy groceries, save for retirement plan, for a future that's becoming more uncertain by the day. That's the real story behind the helicopters. That's what they don't want you focused on while you're watching the spectacle. The operation in Venezuela wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about human rights. It wasn't even really about Maduro. It was about a financial system that's dying and an empire willing to use violence to keep it on life support for a few more years. But you can't stop structural change with helicopters.